Rival gangs were tearing the streets of New Orleans apart. Joseph Macheca armed the Messina faction, sparking shootings, ambushes, and assassinations. And in the middle of that chaos, new forces were starting to move, men with ambition, patience, and plans of their own. While Joseph battled Raffaele Agnello, a quiet figure moved in the shadows beside him, watching, waiting, until Agnello, the city's Sicilian boss, saw his era end abruptly with one sudden shot. But Agnello's fall didn't calm the streets. It cleared the way for the men already moving into his place, and one of them had roots far deeper than New Orleans. It was 1869, and Salvatore Matranga stood at the head of the American Stupighieri, a secretive brotherhood born in Monreale, Sicily, the Matranga family's hometown. Sicily had no single mafia at the time. Every town had its own society with its own loyalties and rivalries. The Stupighieri were one of those groups, and the one that would become the foundation of the first true mafia family in the United States, long before New York ever tried to claim the title. From the Matrangas to Carlos Marcello, this was the beginning of an unbroken line of bosses that would define the New Orleans crime family for more than a century. Salvatore had likely been a member of the Stupighieri back in Sicily, and he was probably one of the few members operating in the United States. The American branch functioned as an outpost of the Sicilian society, small, quiet, but loyal to its roots. But Salvatore wasn't interested in keeping the brotherhood quiet. He intended to expand it. The first order of business was recruitment. Unlike Agnello, Salvatore didn't limit himself to men from his hometown. He welcomed Sicilians from all over the island, including Agnello's old rivals, the men from Messina. His own sons, Charles and Antonio, were among the earliest initiates. And while there's no conclusive record of it, Joseph Macheca was almost certainly brought into the fold. As you'll see, his involvement in the organization went far beyond that of an outsider. With the Matranga brothers and Joseph Macheca brought in, Salvatore's inner circle began to take shape. With his closest men assembled, Salvatore turned outward, calling on others he expected to stand with him. And once the invitation was given, refusal wasn't an option. The ceremony would follow. According to legend, the initiation ceremony itself was darker than anything the American public imagined when they spoke of the Mafia. The Stupighieri ritual carried an almost pagan weight, something old, secret, and meant to bind a man for life. Inductees were led into a dark room lit only by a single candle. Cloaked figures stood along the walls, their faces hidden in shadows. On the table before them lay a candle, a dagger, a pistol, and papers marked with strange symbolic drawings. The boss, also hooded, would approach holding a human skull, a reminder of what loyalty ultimately cost. New members swore their oaths while staring into those empty eyes. Then their finger was cut with the dagger, the blood marking them as bound to the brotherhood. The symbolic papers, often depicting skulls, knives, or firearms, were placed in their hands and set on fire, their ashes falling to the floor. Only then were they led to sit among the cloaked brothers, no longer outsiders, but part of the society. With the Stupighieri growing in power, Raffaele Agnello's Palermo faction faced a choice: leave the city, join the Matrangas, or stay loyal to Peppino Agnello, Raffaele's brother, who was barely holding together the remnants of their organization. In the end, the Palermo men split in all three directions. For the Matrangas, complete control of New Orleans required one final step: removing Peppino Agnello and the last remnants of his brother's faction. From 1869 to 1872, at least 3 attempts were made on Peppino's life. Miraculously, he survived them all. First, a stabbing that drove a knife into his chest, then a rifle slug that tore through him, but failed to kill him. In a third attempt, he escaped entirely. But his luck finally ran out. The last attack sparked a chase from the docks, spilling onto a boat, ending with another gunshot to the chest. This time, though, Peppino didn't get back up. But control wasn't yet seized, because another Sicilian brotherhood remained. The Giardinieri, which was led by the Provenzanos, would challenge the Matrangas and lead New Orleans into a war that would go down as the first mafia war in American history. The Provenzanos operated differently from the Matrangas. Both groups had their enforcers. Both had men willing to spill blood. But the Provenzanos moved with a different kind of presence. They mingled with New Orleans' elite, moved comfortably among businessmen and politicians, and maintained ties inside the city's government. The rivalry between these families didn't start in New Orleans. Both the Stupighieri and the Giardinieri were satellite branches of their Sicilian organizations, and a war that began in Sicily soon extended onto American soil. The connection between the two worlds can best be seen through the story of Salvatore Marino, who was the recognized leader of the Monreale Stupighieri. In 1875, he was arrested for murder in Sicily, but managed to escape and flee to the United States. When he arrived in New Orleans, he took over leadership from Matranga. Marino's arrival, and Matranga's immediate step down, suggests something critical about this era. The American branch still answered to Sicily, and if New Orleans was still answering to Sicily, then the fighting that was beginning to form here wasn't a local feud at all. It was a continuation of the Sicilian War, carried across the ocean. Just a few years later, in 1878, Marino fell ill with yellow fever, a common and deadly disease in the city's sweltering summers. As his condition worsened, he summoned a friend to his bedside and begged him to burn a set of secret papers. But instead of destroying them, he kept them and waited for Marino's imminent death. Then he went to Sicily and turned the documents over to Italian authorities. Inside, the papers revealed the inner workings of the Stupagiri, details about membership, which Marino claimed numbered in the thousands between Sicily and New Orleans. Leadership, naming both himself and Matranga as bosses of the American branch. And he gave an account of the ongoing war between the Stupagiri and the Giardinieri. But 1878 brought more than just the death of Marino. It also marked the beginning of a new problem for the Matranga organization. That same year, a notorious Sicilian outlaw named Giuseppe Esposito arrived in New Orleans. His arrival would upend the balance of the city's underworld. This is where the threads of early American Mafia history begin to pull together. The events that will eventually lead to the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessy. Many people claim that Esposito was the first mafia boss in the United States, but, as we've already seen, that title belongs to Rafael Agnello. Still, Esposito's story is a huge part of early American Mafia history. Back in Sicily, he was already infamous, accused of kidnapping a wealthy British citizen and allegedly sending the man's body parts to his family as part of a ransom demand. Italian authorities captured him, but, like so many outlaws of the era, he escaped. Under a false name, he fled to the United States. Unlike most Sicilians of the era, Esposito didn't arrive through New Orleans. He went first to New York. But New York offered him nothing. The city's underworld was already controlled by Irish and Jewish gangs, and the small Italian community that did exist was made up mostly of Northerners, not Sicilians. There was no foothold there for a man like Esposito. He probably didn't care much for the cold either. And while Sicilians had plenty of reasons to migrate to New Orleans, cheap steamship passage, a climate closer to home, and familiar kinds of work in fishing and agriculture, Esposito likely felt the pull even more strongly. So before long, he made his way south to a city that looked and felt far more like Sicily than New York ever could. Esposito's arrival actually seems to have cooled the tensions between the Provenzanos and the Matrangas. He moved between both factions with ease, acting as an informal mediator, perhaps even something like a first among equals, long before the idea of a boss of bosses ever emerged. Nothing in the record states this outright, but when you read between the lines, that's the conclusion the evidence points toward. Either way, the war paused, and Esposito began living the high life. Under his assumed name, he blended into New Orleans society, marrying, starting a family, and enjoying a comfort he'd never known back home. For nearly 3 years, he held quiet but considerable influence over the city's underworld. During that time, one thing became clear. Esposito favored the Provenzanos. The Giardinieri gained control over the lucrative French Quarter docks, a slight the Matrangas would neither forget nor forgive. And Joseph Macheca, a major fruit importer closely tied to the Matranga network, could not have been happy about losing such valuable ground. But while life seemed calm in New Orleans, the Italian government hadn't forgotten about Esposito. There was still a large reward on his head, and eventually word reached Italy that he was hiding out in the United States under a false identity. The Italian authorities contacted a private detective agency in New York. That agency followed his trail south, all the way to New Orleans. And when they arrived, they turned to one man for help, Detective David Hennessy. Hennessy got to work immediately, reaching out to his contacts in Little Palermo. No one knows exactly how he uncovered Esposito's true identity, only that eventually he did. Some say it was Esposito's new wife, furious after learning he already had a family in Italy. Others believe the tip came from someone in the Matranga camp, hoping Hennessy would remove a rival for them. But only one name ever appeared in the record, a mysterious man called Mr. Panasolo. No one knew who he was, and strangely, he never even tried to collect the large reward the Italian government had posted. Whoever Panasolo was, his information was good. All Hennessy had was a simple sketch of Esposito, handed to him by the Italian consul. But it was enough. He was already on the fugitive's trail. Esposito, convinced he was untouchable, walked the same route to the market every single day. Hennessy watched. He studied the routine, learned the rhythm, and waited. Once he understood the pattern, he began to prepare his plan. On July 5, 1881, a police wagon waited near Jackson Square. Hennessy sat on a nearby bench, blending in with the crowd as best he could. When Esposito approached, Hennessy gave the signal. He and his partner sprang into action. They grabbed Esposito, forced him into the wagon, and the team sped away. They drove through the city in a deliberate zigzag, making sure no one could follow them, and giving no chance for anyone loyal to Esposito to attempt a rescue. He was hidden away in a police garage, kept completely out of sight until federal marshals arrived to take him back to New York. And with that, Esposito's time in New Orleans was over, forever. Esposito never admitted who he was. Even during the extradition hearing, he clung to his alias, Vincenzo Rebello, and denied everything. But the evidence held. He was sent back to Italy, tried for his crimes, and spent the rest of his life in prison. With Esposito gone, the balance of power in New Orleans shifted once again. Hennessy became famous across the nation for capturing the notorious fugitive, earning both the admiration of the city and a rise to chief of police. But his troubles with the Mafia were far from over. Esposito had acted as a quiet buffer between the Matrangas and the Provenzanos. Without him, the old tensions began to rise again, slowly at first, then with growing force, and the men who once relied on Esposito to keep the peace now found themselves staring at a power vacuum. Little did Hennessy know, things were only about to get worse. The fragile balance Esposito enforced collapsed almost overnight. There was nothing left to keep the Matrangas and Provenzanos from going back to war. Murders erupted constantly on both sides. The Matrangas were determined to take control of the markets, and especially the docks, and they were willing to kill for it. Newspapers were soon filled with reports of Sicilian killings across the city. The violence was no longer confined to the docks or the underworld. Ordinary citizens were fed up with what they called the Sicilian vendetta, and Hennessy knew something had to be done. Under mounting public pressure, Hennessy reached out to Joseph Macheca. He asked him to speak with Charles Matranga, who had taken over as boss after his father's retirement. Hennessy wanted to arrange a meeting between the Matrangas and the Provenzanos, hoping to negotiate a peace. By this point, Joseph was wealthy and influential, far more than a typical underworld figure. To most of the city, he appeared to be a respectable businessman and community leader, not a common thug, but Hennessy knew exactly who Joseph was connected to. By this point, he had been dealing with the Sicilians in New Orleans for years, and understood just how much influence Joseph could wield, both in the criminal underworld and in the eyes of the public. Joseph's exact role within the Stupigheria at this point isn't fully known. The historical sources are limited, and beyond them, any interpretation requires drawing reasonable conclusions rather than stating firm facts. What is clear, though, is that Joseph was very close to Charles Matranga. He was the one who arranged the meeting and convinced Charles to even sit down with the Provenzanos. Based on that, and on other surrounding evidence, it's possible Joseph was acting in a role we would today describe as a consigliere, a trusted advisor. Whatever Joseph's exact role was in the organization, he did have some standing. The meeting went forward as planned. From Hennessy's perspective, the meeting appeared to be a success. A peace accord was reached between the Matrangas and the Provenzanos. What isn't entirely clear is how either side truly felt afterward, but we do know how Joseph reacted. After the meeting, Joseph was overheard in a fit of anger over the peace agreement. That reaction is revealing. It suggests that while Joseph was deeply involved in the family's affairs, he was not the one in charge, despite later attempts by some historians to portray him as a mafia boss of the era. Either way, Joseph got his wish. The fragile peace didn't last long. Not long after the meeting, blood was back on the streets. One night, Charles Matranga's brother Antonio and several of their men were working late at the docks, overseeing the unloading of ships. When the work was done, they climbed into a horse-drawn buggy and began the ride back toward the quarter. Spirits were high. The Matrangas had just beaten the Provenzanos for a lucrative dock contract. But the celebration was short-lived. Out of the darkness, a voice shouted in Italian from the tree line. Before they could even react, the night exploded with gunfire. Muzzle flashes tore through the dark as bullets ripped into the wagon. The panicked horses bolted, dragging the buggy wildly through the streets until they finally came to a stop. When the dust settled, Antonio and the others lay bleeding. Antonio survived, but the wounds were so severe that he lost a leg. On the scene quickly was none other than Hennessy. As soon as he learned who the victims were, he understood, just as everyone else in the city did, who was responsible and what the attack truly meant. The war was back on and retaliation was coming. 6 Provenzano men were quickly arrested, including 2 brothers of the boss, George Provenzano. Even so, it didn't take long for accusations of favoritism to surface, with critics claiming Hennessy was going easy on the Provenzanos. Joseph Macheca wasted no time fanning the flames. He went straight to the newspapers, accusing Hennessy of paying for the Provenzanos' board in jail, essentially the 19th century equivalent of putting money on their books. And to be fair, the accusations weren't entirely unfounded. Hennessy openly admitted that he was friends with the Provenzanos, though he insisted he would never defend them in court. Eventually, the shooters were found guilty, but that was far from the end of it. Hennessy didn't stop there. He kept digging, working closely with the Italian consul to track down Sicilian fugitives hiding in New Orleans. many of them tied directly to the Matranga organization. But in the process of gathering that evidence, something unexpected happened. Information Hennessy presented ultimately gave a judge grounds to overturn the Provenzano shooter's convictions. To the Matrangas, this wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. And now, Hennessy had placed himself squarely in the crosshairs of the Stupaghieri. It was the evening of October 15th, 1890, a quiet, rain-soaked night in New Orleans. Within moments, the city would be shaken to its core. What followed wouldn't just send shockwaves through New Orleans, but across the entire nation, turning the word mafia into a household name for the first time. Joseph Macheca dressed sharply that night, a fine suit, polished shoes, the picture of respectability. He met with Charles Matranga and several of the organization's key men. Together they made their way through the French Quarter, blending charm with calculation. They were on their way to a play, but it wasn't just for entertainment. On the walk over, they stopped to greet a police officer, casually asking him for the time, making sure to be seen, to be remembered. At the theater, they took seats in the very front row, waving to familiar faces in the audience, even the Italian consul, who nodded in acknowledgement. After the show ended, around 11 p.m., the group strolled back through the lively streets, once again crossing paths with the same officer and offering another friendly word. Then it was off to a nearby restaurant. Laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses filled the room as the men ate, drank, and socialized, openly, confidently, almost performatively, as if daring anyone to question who they were. But the good mood didn't last. The door swung open, and a man burst inside, his face pale and voice trembling. He brought news that froze every conversation in the room. The police chief had been ambushed. The news didn't appear to faze the group of men. They didn't act surprised, alarmed, gleeful, or sad. They lingered a while longer, then got ready to leave. Before their night was over, though, Joseph did end up showing some emotion about the ambush, telling a friend that he was sorry that the chief didn't die right there in the street. While Hennessy fought for his life in the hospital, police wasted no time rounding up suspects. The first arrest was Pietro Monastero, a recent immigrant who lived directly across the street from the chief's home. Struggling to explain himself in broken English, Monastero claimed he was a humble shoemaker who used his house as a small workshop. But Sergeant Joseph McCabe wasn't convinced. When he searched Monastero's cramped one-room shack, something immediately felt off. There were hardly any cobbler's tools, and only a single pair of shoes tucked under the bed, a pair that, rather suspiciously, was still caked in fresh mud. Even more telling, McCabe uncovered a ramrod for a muzzleloader and a wad of cash, $850, a fortune for a shoemaker who seemed to have no shoes to sell. McCabe knew this wasn't just some random Italian laborer. He'd worked Little Palermo for years and understood the tangled web of mafia politics that ran beneath the surface. The names, the rivalries, the alliances, he knew them all. After arresting Monastero, McCabe made his way to Poydras Market, the turf controlled by the Stupaghieri. If Monastero had friends, real ones, McCabe figured that's where he'd find them. At Poydras Market, McCabe found one of Monastero's friends, Antonio Marchesi, along with his teenage son, as they set up their fruit stand for the morning. When questioned, neither could offer an alibi for the night before. Even more suspicious, Antonio couldn't explain how he'd come into possession of a crisp $100 bill, a small fortune in those days. McCabe sent the two men to detectives for further questioning, though the boy was quickly released, likely because of his age. But freedom for the boy didn't last long. Not long after his release, he was overheard bragging to other neighborhood kids that he'd acted as lookout for the shooters. He even claimed his father had been one of them, and gave chilling details saying he'd whistled the Italian Royal March as the signal to begin the attack. McCabe pressed on. Next, he went looking for Antonio Bagnetto, a night guard at the market who had been reported missing from his post during the night. McCabe found him near his home, pale and visibly nervous. Witnesses would later swear they saw Bagnetto near the scene of the ambush. By the following morning, police had made another arrest. Antonio Scafidi was taken into custody after witnesses described one of the shooters wearing an oilcloth as a raincoat, the same kind of oilcloth Scafidi was known to keep over his fruit stand. Suspiciously, that cloth was now missing, and when McCabe found Scafidi, he was still wearing the same clothes he'd worn the night before. 5 days later came the arrest of Manuel Polizzi. A witness claimed to have seen one of the gunmen stumble and fall while fleeing the scene, and Polizzi bore fresh injuries that fit the story perfectly. He tried to explain them away, saying he'd fallen off a cart and had been treated by a doctor named Basilera. But there was no such doctor in New Orleans. And finally, investigators turned to the biggest names of all, Charles Matranga and Joseph Macheca. Both men were charged as the masterminds behind the hit on Chief Hennessy. The police swept through Little Palermo like a storm, rounding up roughly 250 Italians. Most were innocent, terrified men pulled from their homes without explanation. The Italian consul quickly raised formal protests, furious that so many Italian citizens had been mistreated, arrested without cause, and searched without warrants. What began as an attempted murder investigation was now spiraling into an international incident, one that would strain relations between the United States and the newly unified Kingdom of Italy. Many of those arrested had nothing to do with the attack on Chief Hennessy. They were swept up in a wave of fear, politics, and ethnic suspicion, not evidence. But the men who remained behind bars were not chosen at random. As we saw earlier with McCabe, investigators focused on individuals tied to specific witness accounts, physical evidence, and known associations within the criminal networks that had fueled the violence for years. As the city reeled from mass arrest and diplomatic fallout, Hennessy lay gravely wounded, his condition worsening by the hour. And then came the worst news of all. Chief Hennessy succumbed to his wounds the following day. His death changed the investigation from attempted murder to murder. By the time the smoke cleared, 19 men, all known or suspected members or associates of the Sicilian underworld, stood formally accused. Charged as principals, meaning the suspected gunmen and direct participants were Antonio Scafidi, Bastiano Incardona, Pietro Monastero, Antonio Bagneto, Antonio Marcesi, Salvatore Sinceri, Loreto Comitis, Peter Natale, and Manuel Polizzi. Asperi Marchesi was held and suspected as a principal, but was never charged, again probably due to his age. Joseph Macheca, Charles Matranga, Rocco Gerasi, James Caruso, John Caruso, Charles Pitorno, Frank Romero, Charles Trena, and Charles Piezzo were charged as the masterminds, the men who allegedly planned the hit. In the end, none of the 19 were released before the case reached its conclusion, even though only 8 would ever stand trial, the very men whose arrests and evidence we've just examined. Life in jail for these men was nothing glamorous. Matranga and Joseph managed to pull a few strings. Their money bought them slightly better conditions. But for most of the others, it was misery. 19th century prisons were filthy, overcrowded, and violent. And they weren't alone inside. Their bitter enemies, the Provenzanos, were locked up alongside them. Between the filth, the fear, and the constant threat of violence, life behind bars was anything but peaceful. One inmate was hit especially harder than the rest. Manuel Polizzi had a reputation for being slow-witted and unstable, not incapable of functioning, but clearly limited, the kind of man others saw as easily confused and easily led. That perception made him expendable. He had no real standing within the Stupigeri, and prison only reinforced how little he mattered to them. Behind bars, Polizzi unraveled. He grew withdrawn, muttered to himself, snapped at his fellow Matranga men, and quickly became an easy target for the Provenzanos, who exploited him whenever they could. But just when it seemed he was coming apart completely, something changed. Polizzi made a friend. Francis De Mayo isn't nearly as well known in history as he should be, and yet he may well have been the first undercover agent to ever penetrate the inner workings of the American Mafia. Considering the secrecy, the small size, and loyalty of these organizations in the 19th century, it's almost impossible to imagine anyone getting that close. De Mayo worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency out of Philadelphia. Of Southern Italian descent, with olive skin and dark hair, he could blend in easily. In his younger years, he'd worked on a tugboat, which meant he was right at home among dock workers, the very men who would prove invaluable in New Orleans, where mafia influence ran deep along the waterfront. It didn't take long after Hennessy's murder for the Pinkerton Detective Agency to contact officials in New Orleans about their unique agent. They asked Francis De Mayo whether he believed he could infiltrate the mafia. Confident in his experience dealing with Sicilian networks in Philadelphia and New York, he said he could. But Francis didn't hide his concern. In his words, New Orleans was different, the place where the Sicilians went, and what he described as the headquarters of the mafia in the United States. They were stronger, better organized, and more deeply rooted than anywhere he had worked before. That reality often surprises people today. Many assume cities like New York City or Chicago were always the center of organized crime in America, but for a long time, that simply wasn't the case. In the late 19th century, New Orleans stood at the center of Sicilian organized crime in the United States. It was the earliest foothold, the most entrenched, and the most connected to Sicily itself. Even as other cities rose in the 20th century, New Orleans retained a unique status, treated with an unusual level of respect as the oldest and original power base, what many later figures would regard as the first true mafia family in America. Either way, De Mayo was ready and willing. The plan moved forward when he met personally with William Pinkerton in Philadelphia to discuss the details of his mission. After formally accepting the assignment, De Mayo was sent to New York City, where he purchased a new set of clothes, complete with a manufacturer's label stitched inside, a small but crucial detail meant to authenticate his cover. From there, he traveled on to Chicago, where he received his final orders. DeMeo would pose as an Italian counterfeiter, one of the mafia's most common trades in both Sicily and the United States at the time. To make the cover stick, he would be deliberately arrested by the United States Secret Service just outside of New Orleans. He would be sent to Orleans Parish Prison, locked inside alongside the very men accused of murdering Chief Hennessy. DeMeo was assured that only 6 people in the entire country knew the operation even existed: the Pinkerton brothers themselves, Henry Minster from the Philadelphia office, the district attorney of New Orleans, the head of the Secret Service in Washington, and the head of his local office in New Orleans. Under his new alias, Antonio Ruggiero, DeMeo boarded a train south. He stopped first in Hammond, then continued on to Amite, where he rented a small room at a local boarding house. The stage was set. From there, the United States Secret Service office in New Orleans was contacted, and preparations began for the arrest that would send Francis deep into the heart of the Sicilian underworld. When he entered Orleans Parish Prison, he was met with more than the stench of sweat and iron. He was met with suspicion. Dozens of hardened eyes followed him into the cell block. Dark-haired Italian from the Northeast suddenly appearing on their turf. The Sicilians inside didn't trust outsiders, especially ones they'd never heard of before. It didn't take long for one of the Stupighieri leaders, Frank Romero, to confront him. The questioning sharpened quickly. Suspicion hung in the air. Francis understood what was happening. Inside that world, allowing yourself to be questioned was dangerous. A man who didn't answer a challenge forcefully invited more of them, so he acted. He struck Romero, the punch landing squarely across his face. Nearly a century later, undercover agent Joe Pistone, known as Donnie Brasco, would describe facing the same calculation. Accused of being a rat, Pistone knew a wise guy wouldn't let that stand. He punched the man who challenged him. Francis had already learned the same lesson long before. That single punch earned him a strange kind of respect. Word spread fast through the cell block. Leave the new guy alone. But he wasn't out of danger just yet. That night, as DeMeo lay awake in his cot, he overheard one of the guards whispering to a prisoner, warning him that an undercover agent had been sent inside to gather information. The blood must have drained from his face in that moment. Only 6 men in the entire country were supposed to know about his mission. And yet somehow word had already reached the inmates. It was a chilling reminder of the mafia's reach, even behind bars. But Francis caught a break the next morning. A guard brought in a newspaper carrying a story about a man named Antonio Ruggiero, arrested in Amite and described as an infamous Italian counterfeiter. The paper didn't stay in one set of hands for long. It made its way through the cell block, quietly reinforcing the cover DeMeo had been sent in to sell. Over time, he began to earn a measure of trust among the Matranga men. He was accepted as a legitimate criminal, someone who belonged. That trust allowed him to start gathering information. He later reported overhearing conversations among the Matranga leadership about bribing and intimidating witnesses connected to their case. But even behind bars, and even among their own, none of the men spoke openly about their direct involvement in the murder of Chief Hennessy. Eavesdropping alone wasn't enough. He needed someone vulnerable, someone isolated, someone he could reach. That person was Manuel Polizzi. By then, Polizzi had grown withdrawn and visibly on edge. He kept to himself, spoke less, and seemed increasingly overwhelmed by the pressure around him. The others noticed, they mocked him, took advantage of him, and treated him like dead weight. That was the opening Francis DeMeo had been waiting for. He began quietly protecting Polizzi, offering conversation, companionship, and small gestures of kindness. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to earn his trust. He played on Polizzi's paranoia, convincing him that his food and wine were being poisoned. He would slap the fork from Polizzi's hand, warning him that the grated cheese on his spaghetti had been laced. He'd pour out Polizzi's wine, whispering that he could smell cyanide in it. Soon enough, Polizzi trusted no one, except Francis. The methods were harsh, but in that world, they were effective. Before long, Manuel Polizzi began confiding in Francis. He ranted about supposed attempts on his life, about how unjust it was for the Matrangas to betray him after all his loyalty. Francis listened. He nodded. Then carefully he pressed, asking Polizzi to explain what he meant. That was when the dam finally broke. Polizzi spilled everything. He described his role in Chief Hennessy's assassination, where the planning meetings had taken place, who had been there, and even mentioned the boy who had whistled the Italian Royal March to signal the shooters. Piece by piece, DeMeo gathered enough to map the conspiracy from inside the walls of Orleans Parish Prison. With Polizzi's confession, he had what he came for. The outline of the conspiracy was complete. mapped from the inside, corroborating what investigators already suspected. But DeMayo's time inside had taken its toll. The heat, the stench, the constant danger. It all wore him down. He was ready to get out. The plan was simple. His attorney would file a writ of habeas corpus, the coded signal that the operation was complete, except there was a problem. DeMayo's court-appointed lawyer discovered who he really was and wanted no part of a war with the Mafia. He quit on the spot. For a time, the operation hung in limbo. He was still inside, his cover was thinning, and his body was failing him. 19th century prisons offered little more than bare survival. Most inmates relied on family to bring extra food. He had no one. He survived on jail rations alone, thin, foul slop that left him losing weight and growing weaker by the day. Quietly, the Pinkerton Detective Agency scrambled to fix the damage. It took time to secure a replacement, a young, ambitious attorney willing to take the case without asking too many questions. Only then was the writ of habeas corpus finally filed. Soon after, DeMayo walked free. Years later, when he was interviewed about the assignment, he laughed as he recalled the young lawyer who'd taken over the case. The attorney strutted around the courthouse, bragging that he had accomplished what no one else could, securing a prisoner's release with a writ of habeas corpus. After everything he endured on the inside, the irony wasn't lost on him. Despite all the intelligence he gathered, DeMayo was never called to testify. For Francis, freedom came as a relief, but one man left inside Orleans Parish Prison did not handle it well. For Manuel Polizzi, the loss of his only ally was devastating. Without DeMayo's protection, the paranoia that had been carefully stoked now consumed him. He refused food, refused drink, terrified that anything he touched might be poisoned. Isolated from the others and trapped inside his own fears, Polizzi's already fragile grasp on reality began to collapse. The trial itself unfolded much like any other murder case, but Manuel Polizzi quickly disrupted that normalcy. When he entered the courtroom with the other accused, Polizzi became frantic, shouting in Sicilian, screaming toward the judge. Deputies tried to force him into his chair, but he kept jumping up, resisting, fighting against their grip. Charles Matranga finally spoke up. "He wants to speak with you, Your Honor." The judge asked what Polizzi was saying. Matranga replied that Polizzi was asking for an interpreter. Unsure how to proceed, the judge instructed Matranga to translate. After a brief exchange in Sicilian, Matranga turned back to the bench. "He says he doesn't want to talk to me," Matranga said. "He wants an interpreter." The judge offered a solution. One of Provenzano's men could translate. The objection was immediate. With no other option, the court was suspended until a proper interpreter could be found. Later that day, one was located. Before proceedings resumed, the interpreter met privately with Polizzi, the judge, and Polizzi's attorney. What was said in that meeting isn't clear, but the result was unmistakable. Polizzi emerged with a new attorney, one not affiliated with the other defendants' legal team. As the trial dragged on, Polizzi continued to unravel. He erupted repeatedly in court. At one point, he rushed a courtroom window, trying to throw himself out. The other defendants remained stoic, calm, composed, and largely unmoved by the proceedings. I won't walk through every step of the trial. Much of it followed a familiar pattern. Witnesses for both sides, arguments back and forth, and eventually closing statements from the prosecution and the defense. The final day of the trial was absolute chaos. Hundreds of people crowded outside the courthouse. Inside, every seat was filled. The families of the accused packed the benches. Reporters lined the aisles, scribbling down every movement, every whispered exchange. For the people of New Orleans, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Now they would see whether justice would finally be done for their murdered chief, David Hennessy. The jury returned and handed their verdict to the judge. Judge Joshua G. Baker studied the paper in silence, his eyes moving slowly across the page. The pause felt endless. His expression revealed nothing. One reporter later described the moment like this: "Judge Baker has perfect command over his facial expression, but his countenance certainly betokened surprise at the words he read. His eyes were transfixed upon the paper he held for almost a minute, and when suspense is great, a minute is a long time." The jurors remained still. Seligman, the jury foreman, glanced around and smiled, but there was no answering smile. Everyone present expected a stern verdict. Then came the words no one expected. A mistrial was declared for Manuel Polizzi, Antonio Scafidi, and Pietro Monastero, a shock to much of the courtroom. Not guilty followed for Bastiano Incardona and Charles Matranga. That part surprised few. Even supporters of the prosecution knew the evidence there was thin. But the list didn't stop. Name after name was read aloud. Antonio Bagnetto, Asperi Marchesi, Antonio Marchesi. The tension in the room was unbearable. And then finally, Joseph Macheca, not guilty. One by one, every name was read. Not a single man was convicted. All of the accused were cleared of their charges. Once the remaining lying in wait indictments were dismissed, they would walk free, and there was no other outcome possible. The news of the verdict set New Orleans ablaze. Across the city, anger boiled over. Many residents were furious, convinced that justice had been stolen from them. But down in Little Palermo, the mood was very different. The Sicilian quarter erupted in celebration, music, dancing, food, and laughter spilling into the streets. Fishing boats along the river raised Italian flags, and throughout the neighborhood, American flags were lowered and replaced with those of Italy. Reports even claimed that American flags had been spat on, though whether that actually happened, or was simply a rumor meant to fan the flames, no one could say for certain. Sicilian community leaders denied the accusation, insisting the celebrations were for the birthday of Umberto I, known as the Good. It might have been a believable explanation if his birthday hadn't fallen on March 14th and the celebrations weren't taking place on March 13th, the very day the verdicts were read. The Sicilian quarter celebrated in the streets. But across town, the newly acquitted stupigari were spending their final nights behind bars. Inside the walls of Orleans Parish Prison, there was no doubt a celebration of their own. Relief, laughter, the sense that they had beaten the system. But it wouldn't last. That night, among the city's non-Italian citizens, a few prominent men began quietly plotting vengeance. The next morning, an ominous notice appeared in the newspaper. Mass meeting. All good citizens are invited to attend a mass meeting on Saturday, March 14th, at 10 o'clock in the morning at the Henry Clay statue to take steps to remedy the failure of justice in the Hennessy case. Come prepared for action. That final line, come prepared for action, it sent a chill through the city. It was not a call for justice, it was a call for blood. After reading the notice, the sheriff immediately understood what was coming. He rushed to find the mayor, hoping to secure more men to protect the prison. The Italian consul, Pasquale Corte, had seen the announcement as well. He too recognized the danger and hurried to locate the mayor, but neither man could find him. The mayor had, quite conveniently, made himself unreachable. The sheriff and the consul crossed paths outside the mayor's office. It didn't take long for both men to realize the truth. No help was coming from City Hall. At the time, New Orleans was still the state capital. Their last hope was the governor. Meanwhile, a crowd was swelling along Canal Street, gathering near the Henry Clay statue. Estimates put the number of protesters in the thousands. One by one, the ringleaders climbed the statue, their voices booming as they delivered speeches about vengeance and so-called justice. With every word, the crowd grew louder, angrier, more emboldened, their fury feeding on the rhetoric pouring down from above. At the center of it all stood William Parkerson. He carried a list, and on it were the names of the men to be taken from the prison. While the crowd was being whipped into a frenzy, the sheriff and the consul were meeting with the governor, Francis T. Nichols. The governor attempted to reach the mayor himself, and met the same silence. No response. Nichols then delivered the bad news. Without the mayor formally declaring an emergency and requesting assistance, he had no authority to deploy the National Guard. The two men left deflated. They knew the crowd outside was still growing, and they also knew that once it reached a certain point, violence would be inevitable. Finally, the men giving speeches decided the time had come. A call went out to march on the prison. Men were armed and given assignments as the crowd began moving in a loose formation, chanting, "Who killed the chief?" The same chant prisoners had heard while being transported between the jail and the courthouse. On the way, the mob passed through Congo Square, long known as the center of the city's black community. Surprisingly, some African-American residents joined the march. The warden immediately ordered his staff to reinforce the doors and sent word for reinforcements. Then he went straight to the cells where the Sicilians were being held and told them what was coming. Joseph Macheca, drawing on his experience as a war veteran, asked for weapons so the men could defend themselves. The warden refused. Instead, he handed over a set of keys and told them to hide wherever they could, the only preparation he could offer for the storm about to descend. The crowd finally reached Orleans Parish Prison and poured around it, sealing off every side. At the main gate, William Parkerson stepped forward and confronted the warden, demanding that the prison be opened. The warden refused. Frustrated by the warden's refusal, the mob surged forward, attempting to force its way through the main entrance. At the same time, another group split off and found a weaker point in the structure. They broke through. As the first men poured inside, chaos erupted outside the prison walls. William Parkerson confronted the warden face to face, demanding that the 11 men on his list be handed over. The warden, no doubt terrified as he looked out at a mob now swelling toward nearly 10,000, struggled to keep his composure. He refused to surrender the prisoners, clinging to his duty, but he could not stop what the crowd had come to do. They shoved him aside and pressed forward, relentless in their hunt. Even though this was a mob, Parkerson and the other organizers had a plan. Roughly 25 to 30 men were selected as executioners. Their objective was precise: locate the 11 men on the list, drag them from the prison, and carry out the executions in the street. They were explicitly told not to fire a single shot inside the prison. But in the chaos, in the heat and fury of the moment, discipline collapsed. The crowd's excitement overwhelmed the plan, and events spiraled beyond anyone's control. Inside the prison, panic swept through the Sicilian inmates. Men scrambled for closets, stairwells, and any hiding place they could find. Hearts pounding, breaths shallow. Fear was everywhere. Every shadow felt like a threat. All ran in terror but three: Esperi Marchesi, Charles Matranga, and his right-hand man, Bastiano Incardona, remained seated in their cell with an unsettling calm. Matranga understood exactly what was coming. He appeared to know that he, his trusted lieutenant, and the young Esperi would be spared, and that others would not. In that moment, it seems clear that some of his own men were being sacrificed to the mob. We can never know the details, but it is reasonable to suspect that Matranga reached some kind of understanding with the leaders of the mob, men who, like him, were powerful and well-connected in the city. We can only imagine the moment when the young boy said goodbye to his father, knowing he would likely never see him alive again, or the moment when Joseph left the cell, turning back to see Charles Matranga still seated there, calm and untouched. Joseph must have understood then. He had been betrayed. Were words exchanged between them? Did Matranga explain why he had chosen who would live and who would die? Did Joseph curse him as he walked away? We will never know. Manuel Polizzi was the first man on the list to be captured. Even though he possibly played a role in Chief Hennessy's murder, there was a tragic dimension to his story. The Mafia had clearly exploited his simple-mindedness. He likely wanted nothing more than to belong. Inside the prison, Polizzi was shot and wounded before being dragged out into the street. A rope was tied around his neck and he was hoisted up onto a lamppost. The first attempt failed. The rope slipped and he crashed back to the pavement. On the second try, he was pulled too high and managed to grab hold of the post above him. A man climbed up and struck him repeatedly until he finally lost his grip and fell again. The third attempt succeeded. As his body swung in the street, shots rang out from the crowd into him. Still unsatisfied, they cut him down, stripped him, and mutilated his corpse, leaving it behind as a grim message of vengeance. Back inside the prison, the executioners discovered that several of the men had fled to the women's side of the facility. When they approached, the prisoners broke from their hiding place and ran into the women's recreation yard. There, Rocco Geraci, James Caruso, Antonio Bagneto, Pietro Monastero, Frank Romero, Loreto Comidis, and Charles Trena huddled together, pleading for their lives. Their pleas were met with cold indifference. The men were gunned down where they stood. As the executioners moved closer, they realized Monastero was still barely alive. One more shot ended him. Bagneto, too, clung to life. He was dragged outside and handed over to the waiting crowd. A rope was placed around his neck, and he was hoisted up into a tree. Like Polizzi, the first attempt failed, this time when a branch snapped beneath his weight. The second attempt succeeded. But the violence wasn't over. Joseph Macheca, Antonio Scafidi, and Antonio Marchesi made their way up to the third floor, reaching a gallery that overlooked a section of the prison sealed behind a locked door. As they approached, they were spotted from below. Gunfire erupted, the shots cracking through the hall. The men dove behind the columns for cover, hearts pounding, while Joseph frantically thumbed through the keys, hands shaking as he fought to find the one that would open the door. Antonio Scafidi was the first of the men to fall. Panicked, he bolted from behind one of the columns and was cut down by a volley of rifle fire from below. As Joseph Macheca desperately worked the keys, unaware that he didn't have the one for that door, the executioners closed in. Antonio Marchesi was killed by a gunshot to the head. Curiously, his thumb, forefinger, and middle finger were also blown away. It strongly suggests the shooter was at close range, and that Marchesi had grabbed the barrel of the gun in a final, futile attempt to stop it. By the time Marchesi fell, Joseph Macheca had abandoned the keys altogether. He struck at the lock with whatever he could find, a frantic, hopeless attempt to force it open. The effort ended abruptly. A single bullet tore into the back of his head, just behind the ear, killing him instantly. William Parkerson walked slowly through the prison, surveying the grim work his men had done. Satisfied, he stepped outside and turned to the crowd. In a calm, commanding voice, he addressed them. Bagneto, Scafidi, Polizzi, Joseph Macheca, Monastero, and Marchesi are dead. I have performed the most painful duty of my life today. If you have confidence in me and the gentlemen associated with me, I ask you to disperse and return quietly to your homes. You have acted like men, now go home like men." For a moment, silence hung over the crowd, heavy with shock and awe. Then, almost as one, they began to drift away, slowly dispersing into the city. The streets were left eerily quiet, the chaos fading into an unsettling calm. News of the lynching spread quickly, not just across the country, but around the world. Several of the men who had been killed were still subjects of Italy. The Italian consul, Pasquale Corte, left New Orleans and traveled to Rome to report what had happened. The Italian government formally demanded that those responsible for the lynchings be prosecuted. When the United States refused, Italy recalled its ambassador from Washington. The United States responded in kind, recalling its ambassador from Rome. Diplomatic tensions escalated so sharply that, for a time, war between the two nations was openly discussed. War was ultimately avoided, but the tension did not simply fade away. An agreement was reached. Benjamin Harrison authorized an indemnity payment of $2,211 to the families of each of the deceased, a diplomatic settlement, not an admission of wrongdoing. The following year, in 1892, Harrison proclaimed the first national observance of Columbus Day. It was a symbolic gesture meant to honor Italian heritage and ease the badly strained relations between the United States and Italy. As brutal as the lynchings were, they did not mark the end of the Mafia in New Orleans, or anywhere else in the country. Charles Matranga emerged stronger than ever, and from that point forward rarely faced serious trouble with the law. In time, he defeated the Provençanos and became the undisputed ruler of the city's underworld. When he finally stepped aside, power passed down a lineage that can be traced from Matranga to Carlos Marcello, and onward through the men who would control New Orleans for the next century. The influence of New Orleans on the rest of the country did not fade. It endured for decades. Members of the city's mafia appeared again and again at the center of some of the 20th century's most consequential moments, from the infamous Appalachian meeting to the casinos of Cuba to Las Vegas. And according to some accounts, even the assassination of a president. In the aftermath of the Hennessy lynching, mafia families across the country were reshaped by men who fled New Orleans. One of the executioners eventually moved to Tampa and was stunned to find so many familiar faces from the Stupagiri already there. Fearing further vigilante violence, these men had scattered, relocating and rebuilding their operations elsewhere. Many of the early figures in the Tampa Mafia also traced their roots to Montreal, the Stupagiri's original home, making it almost certain those connections never truly disappeared. The first boss of the Dallas crime family came out of Louisiana, and for years Dallas functioned as little more than a satellite of the New Orleans crime family. Vito DiGiorgio, a founding figure in the Los Angeles crime family, also rose through the New Orleans organization before heading west. Even one of the earliest bosses in New York City, Giuseppe Morello, spent time in Louisiana before making his mark in the Big Apple. New Orleans was the epicenter of the earthquake we called the Mafia. It took shape in this port city just before the Civil War, and over the decades that followed, its tremors reshaped families, power, and violence from Los Angeles to Tampa to New York. What began at this city on the Mississippi left a legacy that would echo for generations.